Yeah. Well, I could see if there's another time. If there's another time, I'll let you know.
Uh-huh. Still recording. Yeah, okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2:31. Did everybody have a good weekend? Yeah. Did you guys go to the game on Thursday? Some of you did. Did we win or lose?
Well,
We won. Okay, fine. That's great. So I got all your papers. I have not finished grading. I will finish grading those before the 7-day turnover on Sunday. Any questions about your cancer presentations coming up soon? Has anybody started working on them some more? Okay, we'll get to working on them. I would hate to have you working on over Thanksgiving break. All right, any questions or concerns about anything today? So this week we're covering influenza, pneumonia, and vaccinations/immunizations. Today we're going to focus on influenza, pneumonia, and there is an activity we're going to do on Thursday. That's because we need to cover all the content so that you can have all the pieces together to do the activity. There will be a worksheet to work on. We'll work on these during the last 15 minutes of class today. And you'll turn it in on Thursday like we did 2 weeks ago. All right. So before we even start talking about, well, first of all, here are the objectives. We're going to talk about the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic, because there is a difference, and it makes a difference when we're talking about how big a outbreak of something was. We did these front lights. Do you remember which one? There we go. We're going to list some of the influenza transmission routes, talk about how we get the flu. We will also talk about the difference between influenza and pneumonia. There's something called antigenic shift and drift in influenza. We'll be able to distinguish between the two by the end of the class and how they work together. And lastly, with pneumonia, we want to talk about diagnosis and treatment options for pneumonia. Okay, so first and foremost, we want to distinguish between epidemics and pandemics. Before we can even get there, we must talk about what an outbreak is and what does it mean to have something being endemic in a society. Has anybody heard of the word endemic before? Okay, well, the definition is up there. I was going to ask, what does it mean? So an outbreak is the sudden occurrence of a disease in a community which has never experienced the disease before, or it is when you have cases of a disease occurring in large numbers greater than expected in a defined area. For example, we have an outbreak. So there are two cases where you can have an outbreak. There's one case where something has never happened here before. There's, I don't know, chikungunya. It's never been in Toledo before. If it were to happen, we would call it an outbreak because it has never occurred here before. I'm just saying. I don't know if it has, just for example. And then the other case is if a disease occurs in numbers greater than expected in a defined for example, we have endemic numbers of diseases. So for example, there are things that are in a community at a stable level all the time. If those numbers were to rise above the norm, we'd call it an outbreak. The same goes for like measles. A couple years ago, there was an Ohio State breakout of measles. It became an outbreak because it's typically in the community, but at a very low level. So there are two ways in which we can have an outbreak. An example of an outbreak is also Ebola, which is kind of complex because Ebola eventually became an epidemic. But when Ebola first started, it was an outbreak because it happened in West Africa and it was contained there for a while. Now, something that's endemic, as I mentioned a little bit just now, is there's some disease that can remain active in a given area for years and years. So, we would say dengue fever. Has anybody heard of dengue fever? You, Emma, what is dengue fever, just briefly?
I honestly don't really remember I've heard of it, but I don't really know.
Oh, that's okay. Anybody else heard of dengue fever? At least you've heard of it, that's okay. So it's a zoonotic disease, typically in South America and some African countries. And it's transmitted by the same mosquito that carries Zika, actually. And what happens is the mosquito, it breeds, and where mosquitoes breed, with lots of water and moisture, and it bites and you get dengue fever. This is a very prolonged period of fever. It's endemic because it is known to be in existence in South America and in some African countries. So it's endemic, we know it's there. It wouldn't become an outbreak until the numbers rose above that endemic level. So for each disease, there's a different endemic level. For dengue, there's a specific number of cases. The governments would usually, the WHO, the World Health Organization, would monitor every year to say, well, it's in check, it's not going anywhere. So it says here, dengue, which is spread by mosquitoes, is endemic in more than 100 countries as it is. It's habitually present within the geographic area. So if you were to visit one of these countries, you would look at a travel advisory, and you might want to get a vaccination or take some precautions when you do go to that country. So before we move on, in your own words, what is the difference between an outbreak versus something that's endemic? Casey?
An outbreak is kind of unexpected, or an endemic is kind of expected.
Great, that's a very good way to explain it. Outbreak is unexpected because we suddenly have this rupture of numbers of the disease that used to be endemic, or we have this new cases occurring. Whereas endemic, it's just there. We know it's always there. Good. An epidemic now is the occurrence of a group of illnesses of similar nature and derived from a common source in excess of what would normally be expected in the community or region. So something that's above the endemic level, but it's spreading in more than one country. So for example, when SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, broke out, it started as an outbreak in Asia, in a very small area, but then it spread to dozens of countries around the world and formed an epidemic. So when we talk about epidemics, this example, we are seeing there's a disease that could be endemic, but then it became an outbreak happened, and now it's an epidemic because it spread to different parts of the country or different regions of the world, typically a small region of the world. Questions? So SARS started in Asia, and it spread dozens of countries and took the form of an epidemic. If it had stayed in that area, it would have probably just been considered an outbreak of SARS in that region, in Asia, that Asian region. But because it spread to other countries, it became an epidemic. And here we have Ebola again. Ebola was an outbreak in West Africa, but it started to spread and became an epidemic because it spread to other countries in Africa beyond the West African area. And these will come together very soon. Now we go even bigger, and we have what we call a pandemic. So a pandemic is a global disease outbreak, or in other words, a worldwide epidemic. So it's a disease that's no longer just, so an epidemic, it's affecting a region of the world or some regions of the world, whereas a pandemic is affecting all continents, touched every single continent, or most of the continents. The worldwide epidemic, which of course started off as an outbreak, escalated to the level of an epidemic, and eventually spread to a number of countries across continents. So I highlighted in bold, it started as an outbreak, it went to an epidemic, and now it's in dozens of countries and continents across the world. For example, the influenza, there's Spanish, Asia, and the Hong Kong influenza. They all started off as outbreaks. There's always flu. Flu is something that's very endemic. Endemic because it is just stable. We know there's flu all over, but we know how many, we know roughly it's in check. The CDC isn't alarmed because it's in check. We know that there are so many months of flu every year, and that's fine. It becomes an outbreak when that level rises above what's normal, and it becomes an epidemic when it starts to spread to other countries or regions. And it becomes a pandemic when it starts to spread over more continents in the world. So the 2009 flu pandemic, between 2009 April and August of 2010, there were approximately 18,000 deaths in over 214 countries. The flu virus H1N1 probably originated in Mexico, and within 2 months it spread. So here we have an example of H1N1 in Mexico. It is endemic. It's fine. Flu virus is there. Everybody gets the flu sometimes. Became an outbreak because more people, higher than usual, got this flu, this particular strain. It then became an epidemic because it started to spread. It became a pandemic because it spread across the world. And we had people across the entire world dying. 214 countries were affected. Another example of a pandemic is HIV/AIDS, which started off, this is an example of an outbreak of something new. When HIV first started, it was new because nobody knew what it was or where it came from, so it was an outbreak of this interesting new disease. It became an epidemic because it started to spread. And it's a global pandemic because now countries around the world, all the continents are affected by HIV/AIDS. So HIV/AIDS is a great example of a pandemic. If you think about a pandemic, think about something that killed people in multiple continents. Deadly, it was devastating. So before we move on, who wants to take a stab at explaining the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? Ashley?
Epidemic is more like a smaller community or region, or like an area or like a state or whatnot, and pandemic is larger, like worldwide.
Right.
Just every single, or almost every place.
Exactly, good explanation. So epidemic is more regional, within a few countries. In Africa, for example, the countries are smaller. So you can easily see that there are multiple countries like Nigeria, Ghana, those are all affected by Ebola first. So that's a nice region for an epidemic. Whereas a pandemic is multiple continents. It's typically the distinguishing factor between an epidemic and a pandemic. Thank you, Ashley. Now, what about something that's endemic versus an epidemic? Someone over here. Do you guys want me to go back and explain it again?
Epidemic is more stable in one area, and pandemic is more spread.
Exactly. Thank you. So something that's endemic is always there, or typically always there. We know it's there. It's within check, as we would call it, because the number isn't alarming. And an epidemic, when it starts to spread in different regions, typically different countries in the same area. All right. Make things even more interesting. And there's a term called sporadic, which isn't used very often, but these are things that appear occasionally in unpredictable fashion, like tetanus, for example. These just randomly pop up here and there, but we want to focus more on outbreaks, endemics, epidemics, and pandemics. And here we have endemic, irregularly found in a steady level in a particular region. So it's the common cold, for example, or the flu, just normal flu. An epidemic, sudden increase in morbidity or illness rate and mortality above the norm. People are dying more than usual because of this disease. And a pandemic spreads across continents. For example, HIV/AIDS and the 1918 influenza that kill people, millions of people across the world. I like this quote. Even if you take every year the problems of malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV, which are horrible, pandemic influenza has the potential to in just one swoop, kill so many more people than all those diseases can kill in decades. So we're talking about influenza today, and this quote comes from studying influenza and the Spanish flu that killed millions of people in 1918. And that is interesting because even when we think about malaria, TB, and AIDS, which kills people all the time, the pandemic flu can kill even more people faster because of how quickly it spreads. Okay, so we're jumping into influenza. We're talking about this because, oops, I thought I had a thingy here. Anyhow, we're talking about influenza because it's in the top 10 cause of death in the United States. It is also a big killer across the world if influenza gets out of check and we have a pandemic. Okay, so some symptoms of the flu are things like, what are some symptoms you would have if you had the flu? Any?
Fever.
Yeah. Some congestion, just don't feel, oh my gosh, I cannot find my lovely clicker that I sometimes cannot figure out where's back in front, and this is just going all over. So the flu, or the influenza, it's an infectious disease, and it usually disappears within 2 weeks. That means it usually runs its course within 2 weeks in the human body. Depending on the symptoms you have, it'll be obvious to you if you had it for 2 weeks or not. But for most people, from the beginning of the sore throat or the sniffly nose, it'll last just about 2 weeks until you're completely back to where you were before you had it. Okay, so the influenza, there are actually 3 different strains of influenza. We'll talk about those today. There's influenza A, B, and C. Influenza A and B actually are responsible for most of the viruses that cause flus and common colds in the country. Influenza C is not very pathogenic, doesn't cause as much infection. It does, but it's at very low levels, so we don't pay too much attention to it. Now the reservoir, what is a reservoir? Maddie? What was that? Yeah, so it's like a breeding ground. It's where it's living. It's where it's going to reproduce and replicate. So the primary reservoirs for influenza A are aquatic birds, which is why sometimes we have the bird flu. Anyhow, we'll talk about that later. So it's typically, we can have influenza in things like ducks, pigs, sometimes some mammals as well. But for the most part, it's in ducks and avian animals. All the subtypes can be found in birds. This just means that the virus itself is living in these animals. And somehow in contact with them, we get it from them, from some kind of transmission, whether it's by eating something infected or touching it and, putting your hands in your mouth and whatnot, we somehow get the influenza virus from one of these animals. That's a takeaway message from this slide on the reservoirs. There's some nice videos here, but you can watch it later if you want to. Talks about how you can grow a flu inside of an egg. But how do we get the flu? What are some transmission routes for the flu? Okay.
Not washing your hands.
Not washing your hands, and then what happens when you don't wash your hands? Exactly. And there's a quote in the lecture for Thursday talking about how many times the average person touches their mouth. I think it's their face, like 212 times a day. It's ridiculous. We do it all the time. What are some other ways to spread the flu, or to get the flu? Shayna and then Alice. Corey. Shayna.
Being around someone who's sick with the flu.
How does being around someone who's sick with the flu make you different?
Like kissing them.
It's like exchanging bodily fluids?
Yeah.
Okay. If they sneezed you? Okay. That's what you're saying. coughing, sneezing. Exactly, airborne. It's pretty disgusting. One of these videos really shows you how when someone sneezes, how the particle goes into the air and into somebody else's mouth. We just don't think about it. So when you think about going on a plane and you're flying up there, you're just confined in that area. Somebody sneezes across the road, you're probably going to inhale it unless you're wearing a mask. So some other ways to transmit the flu are things like formites. Formites are things that we touch. So like the mouse, the keyboard, the door handles, the chairs you're sitting into, you put in your hands there, you have no idea where someone else touched. Any conditions for cooler temperatures and low humidity also favor transmission. Crowding and close intermingling favors transmission. So for example, if you're in a dorm and someone has the flu, more than likely it will spread. This is one of the reasons why little kids, when they're in daycare, they get the flu all the time. Like I went home this weekend and my stepkids, they're all sick. Because one child's sick and they're touching each other, they're talking to each other, they're eating and spitting, and they're all gonna get sick. And I'm sure someone at their school is sick. I bet you at the daycare somebody's sick. But this is what happens. You're in a very close quarter for a very long time. You're more than likely to sneeze, cough, touch things, and spit on things, and you're going to probably get sick. Crowding. So, for example, some places like nursing homes, classrooms, and army barracks, very well known for passing infectious diseases, not just the common cold, but other infectious diseases as well. Because we're in a very close area, we're touching the same things, we're breathing the same air, and of course, I'm exhaling and you're inhaling, so if I have something, you're probably getting it at some point. So nursing homes, the elderly already have a reduced and a weakened immune system, so combine that with a very close setting, a very closed off area, increases the likelihood for developing or contracting an infectious disease like the flu. So the incubation period for the flu on average is 2 to 4 days. Sorry, 1 to 4 days. On average is 2 days. The range is 1 to 4 days. So what this means is we can all have the flu, but have a different incubation period. So it can take the flu 1 day to replicate and produce and become transmissible for me than it would for you in like 2 to 3 days. So there's a range, 1 to 4 days, which means that not everyone who has the flu will show symptoms at the same time. Virus shedding and communicability. This is where you are able to pass the virus on to somebody else. So this range is different in adults versus children versus those with compromised immune systems. In an adult, typically within the first 3 to 5 days of the illness. So the incubation period is 1 to 4 days, but between day 3 and 5, you're able to pass the virus on to somebody else, whether you have symptoms or not. So we have my stepkids like every other weekend, well every weekend except for one in a month. And then we flip in the summer and all that. So over the weekend, you know, the kids are all sick. And yesterday, my husband was out of state. He's like, you know, I have a sore throat, all of a sudden. And we saw, he last saw the kids on Sunday morning. So yesterday was Monday, he now has a sore throat. He's already showing symptoms of some sort of an infection. Because you're in the house with the kids, you're probably gonna get something if they have it. It's just hard to avoid it. So the bottom line is, you don't start spreading the virus until the incubation period, your incubation period is passed, even though the incubation period varies from person to person. In children, the virus shedding and communicability lasts a little longer. It's about 7 to 10 days. So even though the average duration of the flu is about 2 weeks, a child who's sick can be passing this on for about 7 to 10 days after they've had it. Someone with an immune compromise, who has a compromised immune system, they have an even longer period of shedding and communicability. Because their immune systems are weakened, they're going to have the virus a little longer. It's going to cause a little bit more damage in them. What are some groups of people who have a compromised immune system? Maddie? The elderly. Who else? Ashley? Exactly. Like an autoimmune disease, a weakened immune system? Exactly. Their immune system is not as strong as it normally would be. What are some other examples? Alex? Infants. Exactly. And all because they don't have an immune system just yet. They were just born. So, which is why some parents, when the babies are born this time of year, they just hide them from everyone because don't touch my baby. I don't want to get my baby sick because that's really bad for the baby. Also, people who have cancer, they're taking chemotherapy or radiation, that is weakening their immune system. Someone who's had an organ transplant, they received a new organ, so now they're taking immunosuppressant drugs to prevent their body from fighting against the organ. And that drug is weakening their immune system. So those are all good examples of people who probably should get the flu vaccine. Maddie?
I have a question.
Huh?
So, I know sometimes we think of the antibiotics when you can get rid of like eating your good bacteria and everything, and then there's a chance for bad bacteria to swoop in and take over. Is that the chance for viruses, or is viruses are not bacteria?
Right, like you said, viruses are not bacteria. So, but what happens is, so let's say you took some antibiotics and now the bad bacteria is growing. Kind of what happens is your immune system is a little weaker. And that is why you're more susceptible to getting the flu virus. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because your immune system is not as sharp as it would have been had it not been for the bacteria imbalance that happened. That is a great question. And that is kind of why some people, like, people would say, oh, don't go outside, you're gonna get the flu. It doesn't make you get the flu, but because you're outside, uncovered, you're cold, your immune system is a little weakened, that makes you more prone to get the flu virus. Okay, so the three subtypes of influenza viruses. There's A, B, and C, like I said earlier. A causes the seasonal epidemics and pandemics. It infects animals, birds, and humans. B is also present in humans. And so is C. C, however, like I said earlier, is less of a burden of disease compared to A and B. In other words, we don't get as many flu infections because of the influenza strain C. It's typically A and B. Influenza A, the subgroups are based on the surface glycoproteins, hematoglutinin, and neuraminidase. So we're going to talk about these a little bit more as we go forward. Influenza B doesn't have any other subcategories, but it's less severe than A. And it causes seasonal epidemics, and it has no animal reservoir. Why is this important? Why do we care about all these strains and where the reservoirs are? Yeah.
The flu virus evolves really quickly, so like it's important to pay attention to which one is like the dominant type that year, because that's the only vaccine is.
Right. It also helps us trace it back to find out where we got it from. I'm thinking of a movie. I can't think of the name of the movie, but it was this lady who got really sick, and it turns out she ate a pig that was contaminated because somebody was sick and they touched it. Does anybody know what movie that is? I have to look it up. But what I was going to say, that was an example of, I'm going to write here, pig, sick lady. That was an example of trying to find out where this virus could have come from. So we also care about this because if there's a bird flu going around, we know it wasn't C, it probably wasn't B, it definitely was A, because A has a reservoir, and the reservoir are animals for A. Also, influenza B causes epidemics, no animal reservoirs. If it's influenza A is what causes pandemics and epidemics. So typically when we talk about the flu virus, we're talking about influenza A. Influenza A, because it matters the most, because it causes more disease and has more weight in terms of mortality and morbidity. It's broken up into these two subgroups, hematoglutinin and neuraminidase. So it's typically called HA and NA. And I color-coded them because they're typically blue and green. You'll see that in some places where they color-code them. So hematoglutinin spikes, these attach to the virus, to the epithelial cells of the virus, and in the respiratory mucus cells, so like in your nasal canals, and they aid in the viral entry into the cells. In other words, this is a subgroup responsible for how the virus will invade your body. Neuraminidase spikes, these play a role in the release of the virus from the cells. So here we have the HA, they're responsible for getting the virus into your body. This will tell you how you're going to get the virus. And there's a lecture next week where we're going to talk about the different entry portals in your body where you can get an infection into your body. It could be a cut, it could be your nose, it could be So HA is responsible for attaching, getting into your body. NA is responsible for releasing the virus into you. Both things need to happen for you to get the flu virus. If it's just in your body and wasn't released, then it's kind of in this inactive state because it's not doing anything, it's not replicating. It needs to be released to replicate, to give you the virus. That is a takeaway for, very simple takeaway, for hematogluten and neuraminidase. Are these present in type in influenza B and C? Who says yes? Who says no? Who does not know? A couple of us don't know. So fair enough. So we are going to back up one here. Whatever previous. So there's 3 subtypes or categories of influenza. Influenza A, B, and C. Influenza A is a big group that causes seasonal epidemics and pandemics. It infects animals and humans, and the subgroups are based on the surface glycoproteins, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Influenza B and C does not have those subgroups, which could be one of the reasons why influenza A is the most aggressive strain of the virus. So when we talk about the neuraminidase and the hemagglutinin, we're not talking about influenza B and C. We're only talking about influenza A. Influenza C is very mild, and it has a very low disease burden. It causes very mild respiratory illnesses in humans, so mild that people don't even report it. It's just like a runny nose, nothing uncomfortable. If you have a lot of the severe effects, you probably have influenza A or B. B is less severe than A. A is the worst possible, which is why we're talking about it. So A has the HA and the NA. What does the HA do versus the NA? Go ahead.
It brings it into the cell.
Brings it into the cell. Who brings it into the cell? Yep, the HA. And what does the NA do? You had your hand up, Trina?
I was gonna say that the NA, I thought that the NA releases it into the body, and that the HA just attaches it to the body.
Right, so I'm glad I asked. So as you said, it helps get it into the body. So the HA attaches and gets it into the body. The NA is what releases it. So without the HA, we wouldn't get it into the body. So here we see the HA, the spikes attach the virus to the epithelial cells, to the respiratory mucosa, and aid the virus in entry into the cells. NA, in bold, releases the new virions from the cells. So the little things inside the virus are released because of the NA.